Hi guys, welcome to Origin. Jack, you asked for video responses to your latest video on Norman Malcolm's essay on Anselm's arguments. Now, I'm going to try and script it as you said. I'll put it in the description. I'll do that as soon as I possibly can. Here we go.
A being whose non-existence is logically impossible is greater than a being whose non-existence is logically possible.
Okay, the problem with this statement is the word greater. It's completely unspecified. We don't know what greater means in this context. Does it mean greater in every conceivable way, or greater in some specific way, which, as I said, is unspecified? And so the problem here is that greater is being used as a weasel word of sorts.
Therefore, a being, a greater than which cannot be conceived, must be one whose non-existence is logically impossible.
Okay, in order to address this second statement, I see that I'm going to have to be more specific about what I mean by the first one. Greater is left unspecified, so we don't know what it means, but it seems like it's being taken to mean one specific thing. That the non-existence logically impossible is simply greater than in some way the non-existence that is logically possible. And that seems to be all that greater means. But in dealing with the second statement, we've not only got exactly the same problem, but we're also, for this definition to work, it has to add even more possibilities for what greater could mean, because a being greater than which cannot be conceived, well, that would have to be greater in every possible way. More powerful, more knowledgeable, physically larger, whatever. Greater in every possible conceivable way, in order to make that being greater than which cannot be conceived. So the same problems carry forward from the first statement, and you're adding more to the definition, so it's not even the same use of the word greater.
God is that which a greater cannot be conceived. As such, God's non-existence is logically impossible.
Right, this is where it gets slightly more complicated. From the first definition, we've already said that greater is unspecified, but it seems to mean one specific thing that links the non-existence of a being being logically impossible to the non-existence of a being being logically possible. Saying that a being is greater simply because his existence absolutely must be the case is debatable. I mean, you're not even specifying what you mean by the word greater, and as such it's kind of left as, well, it's almost like a word with absolutely no meaning. The fact of God's non-existence being logically impossible is only a fact if you can actually specify what you mean by greater in that first context that I mentioned for that first statement. If you can't do that, then the word is essentially meaningless and this whole thing falls apart.
There is a man named Bob, and he's the strongest man in the world. That's a fact. However, it's not a logically necessary truth. That is to say, you can have Bob without having the strongest man in the world. Now, a logically necessary truth would be something, for example, like a square has 4 sides. You cannot have a square without having 4 sides. As such, it's a logically necessary truth. In the same way, God as the greatest of all beings, God as the most perfect of all beings, is a logically necessary truth. That is to say, you cannot have God without having the greatest of all beings. You cannot have God without having the most perfect of all beings.
I don't actually have to say anything new here. The same problems with the logic of the first argument carry forward to this one, and it doesn't even matter if you rephrase it as the most perfect of all beings, because again, perfect still relies on greatest, so it still falls apart.
God being the greatest of all beings, God being that which a greater cannot be conceived, means that God is not dependent. That is, He's not limited. What do I mean by the words dependent and limited? For example, a car is dependent on fuel for its operation. In this way, we would say that the car is limited. It is limited because it needs something in order for it to function. It needs fuel. Given the sense in which I use those words, limited and dependent, God is not dependent, and as such, He is not limited. For example, God is not dependent on anything to bring about His existence, because God, being that which a greater cannot be conceived, His non-existence is logically impossible. So as such, He is not dependent upon anything for His existence. Neither is He dependent on something for His continued existence. Therefore, God is not limited, and as such, God is unlimited.
Okay, I agree with the statements about God not being dependent and not being limited. That has always been the case from every Christian I've ever heard, that in no way is God limited. So I don't need to argue against that, because that was simply used as an additional point to the previous logic, which I've already shown to be problematic, shall we say. In order to make the script as short as possible so that I don't have to worry about space when putting it in the description, I'm only going to script from the very first words that Jack says up until the end of the last clip. So Jack, I hope you found this useful. If you want to make a response, even if it's just in the comment form, you are very welcome to do so. And I also want to add a disclaimer, because I know that some of my subscribers don't like Jack that much. I remember that Jack told Pino that thing about how he thinks atheists deserve to go to hell and stuff like that. Well, you need to understand, first of all, and this is the most important part, the enemy of my friend is not my enemy. So, even if I'm friends with some of you guys and you really hate Jack, that doesn't mean that I have to hate Jack as well. I actually think Jack is, Jack is one of my favourite theists here on YouTube. It's quite hard to explain why, so I'm not going to go into detail about that. If you have problems with Jack, that's fine with me. I'm not going to interfere with anything, just so long as you respect the fact that I don't have problems with Jack. I'd also like to say that some of you guys might think this is an ownage video. You might define this as an ownage video, and if you do, that's fine. I have no problems with that, but I don't see this video as an ownage video, and I'm going to explain. What I see as an ownage video is, yes, it may very well be an intellectual discussion. It may involve, finding out the truth of a certain matter, refuting disinformation or refuting arguments which are impractical or undesired in a specific setting, if you like. Now, in order for it to be an ownage video, in my eyes, it also has to have something which I call ownage tangents. And I'm going to make that the topic of the next video, but basically, to paraphrase, it's any kind of insults or posturing or character assassination or anything which basically turns it from an intellectual discussion in which you try and, which is basically a constructive debate, if you like, into, what's the word I'm looking for, a point scoring contest, if you like. Basically, how big is your EP-ness, just to put it really bluntly. And that's not what I consider this video to be. I consider this to be, I did what I did for purely constructive purposes, to give Jack some insight into possible counter-arguments for Norman Malcolm's essay. So thank you guys for watching. I'll come back as soon as possible, maybe even the same day, with the Ownage Tangents video that I mentioned, and goodbye.